Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. One of the most popularly heard words nowadays, I think certainly is creative economy, which is the key word for the new government, although it is not very clearly defined, but everybody thinks what the creative economy is supposed to mean, but I don't think it is really well defined, since it has multiple dimensions and multiple aspects. One of the important aspects of this creative economy is culture. And we know the culture and creativity play very, very important role in the creative economy. That's for sure. So this morning, we have the best guest speaker who will tell us from his perspective what the Korean creative economy means and it ought to mean. Mr. Sorman has been with us many times before, so he doesn't need a long introduction. And he has written so many books, and most of them have been translated into Korean. And he keeps churning out the new books, and I'm sure they will be translated. And he told me he just wrote a book on the U.S. philosophical, the philanthropic activities, and I'm sure that will be translated into Korean and will be very widely read. And it's actually ought to be widely read. Sorman, as I said, as you know very well, he is a professor and columnist, and I would consider him as one of the leading global thinkers of our time. He has been advocating the ideals of capitalism and democracy all over the world. He comes to Seoul very often because he likes Korea. He's a good friend of Korea, in fact. And, of course, I've been friends with him for many, many years, since early, mid-80s. And he writes very frequently in global leading newspapers, and Le Figaro in France, and Wall Street Journal, and in the United States, and the Financial Times, and many other leading journals. He gave lectures in many universities all over the world, and he teaches in France, mostly the Paris Institute of Political Science. He has been teaching there since early 1970s. I can go on about this very brilliant career, but I will stop here, and I will invite him to share his insights on the creative economy and how creative economy relate to culture and creativity. Okay, with no further ado, I invite Mr. Sorman. Please join me in welcoming.
Well, good morning. I mean, it's always a joy, to accept, Dr. Sakongil's invitation, and it's true that we know each other for quite a long time, and I don't know how long, and we have decided both to forget how long. And these early meetings is always a good opportunity to meet some good friends. And also for me, it's a very stimulating experience, because when a month ago I received a call asking me to give a talk, I said, of course I will. And then I was suggested that I should talk about the creative economy. And so since 1 month and until very early this morning, I must tell you that I keep rewriting my paper on the subject. And because nobody can be against the creative economy to start with. And I will come in a moment with some very specific definition or proposals about what could be considered in the case of South Korea as a creative economy. I will make 7 proposals. But before that, it seems to me, even if it looks to you a little bit academic, to understand why now it feels necessary to talk about the creative economy, what has happened, and what are the reasons. So in other terms, what is the landscape in which you operate? Because in economics, it's not enough to propose a new slogan. And we have to understand that, of course, a new government needs to give some kind of a fresh start to the country and needs to come with some kind of a new slogan. But I'm a bit reluctant as a foreign observer, a friend of South Korea. I'm a bit reluctant because I think it would be regretful if people in South Korea think that everything will change overnight, because the government has decided that everything will be changing. And we have to remember that politics is short-term, but economics is long-term. And there is always in a democracy kind of a time inconsistency between economics and politics. They don't follow the same rhythm, and we have to keep this in mind. Also, another observation that I wanted to make from the very beginning is that let's not forget that South Korea is a huge success. So sometimes you have the impression in this current climate that everything was wrong. Everything went in the wrong direction, and now at last you are going to have a creative and positive and high-growing economy. This is not true, of course. And we always have to remember why it has been a success. And you can build a better economy only if you start from the assets that you already have, and not by erasing, neither by denigrating the past. Third observation I want to make that any economy, and especially in South Korea, can be based only on your local assets. And when I say local assets, I don't mention natural resources, because you have none in South Korea. I'm thinking about the local culture, tradition, civilization, way of doing things. It would be a big mistake to say, well, we have been wrong until now, let's change the way we do things. No, it doesn't work that way. I mean, you have traditions, and the South Korean economy has been based on following a very specific model, which of course was inspired by other nations. I mean, you discovered a long time ago that free trade works, that the chaebol were to a certain extent inspired by the Japanese experience, but the South Korea has been from the beginning a very specific mix with no equivalent in other countries. So I think it would be a mistake to forget that because of this mix, South Korea has become such a successful country. And it would be an error in the name of innovation, novelty, let's start anew, to forget where you come from. And of course, big companies are an easy target, and so it's very easy to go at them. But without these major big companies, where would South Korea be? So I think everything which has been done until today should be taken into consideration. Another, I think, error, maybe a strong word, is that to copy what is done elsewhere is not the solution. And to say, well, the Americans have Silicon Valley, let's build Silicon Valley in South Korea. That doesn't work. Silicon Valley is the translation of a civilization. Okay, it's a very long history. So you cannot repeat what has happened in other countries and copy and repeat it in South Korea. So it's important and significant to see what's going on in other countries, what has been done as a source of knowledge, as a source of inspiration, but certainly not to repeat it in South Korea. This has no meaning. I mean, you have to start with what you have, and what you have is quite remarkable. Now, I think I ask myself, why do we talk about creative economy now? Because the whole developing world share a common preoccupation. Two of them, basically. The first one is that China is able to produce nearly anything at a cheap cost. So China is a competitor for the whole world. And if we want to remain ahead of China, we have to come with new services and new products and new innovation. So this is a strong factor, a strong incentive for a more creative economy. But we are confronted to another problem, which is not China, and which is a global problem. The reality is that the global economy is slowing down. We are in a period of relative slow growth. So in South Korea, like in many countries, everybody lives in the nostalgia of a, 7-8% growth rate. I think we'll never go back there, because this kind of growth rate belonged to a certain period. It was the time of the take-off of South Korean and other economies, and also the 80s were a very specific period in the economic history. Never before we had seen such a high growth rate, and this happened in circumstances which will not repeat themselves in the future. Some of the circumstances are the end of the Berlin Wall, the fact that suddenly what we call now the emerging countries shifted from a statist economy toward free market economy, including China, which started in 79, but then you had India from 91, you had Brazil from the late 80s. The fact that suddenly this huge country shifted toward a free market economy and became part of the global economy, this has been a major reason why the 80s have been exceptional. And South Korea was, of course, in this global market in a very strong position, because you were already some years ahead of these countries. But what happens in the 80s these countries have emerged, so the kind of growth rate that you have at the very beginning, by bringing billions of people from the rural areas to the city, from agriculture to industry, case of China, of course, you have a 10% growth rate. This is mechanical in a way. You bring a peasant to the industry, you have a 10% growth rate. But this is over. This is over, and this won't be repeated. And also, one of the reasons why we are in a trend of a slower growth is that many countries, for political reason or for any kind of human reason, are more and more attracted by redistribution policies. And redistribution policies slow down the growth rate. And redistribution policy may be justified for many reasons, but when I look at countries like Brazil, for example, or India, not to mention Western Europe, redistribution policy have taken over growth policy. So we have redistribution, but we have no growth. And some of the engines within the emerging country like Brazil and India are disappearing because redistribution comes first. And I think this also is a long-term trend because these countries have become democratic countries and the people want more redistribution, and they don't always see that there is kind of a, a bargain between high growth and high redistribution. The worst, of course, being the welfare state in Western Europe, and where the perspective for growth are extremely bad in the coming years because of the importance of the welfare state. In the United States also, you have a tremendous growth of the welfare state in America since the Obama administration took over, and this also is acting as a brake on the global economy. So I mention this because we are in a cycle, we are in a trend of relatively slow growth. And you cannot beat the trend. You can have the best creative and the best innovative policy in South Korea. You are not alone on this planet. You depend on the global market. And the global market right now is not helpful. So what you can do is not to beat the trend, is to be just a bit above the trend. But if the trend is, let's say, 2 or 3% a year, you will not reach 7% a year. You can be 1 point, maybe 2 points above the trend. So let's be reasonable, and I think, promises should not made saying, well, like, I'm going to beat the market. You don't beat the market. And you don't beat the global trend. You try to adjust. Now, also South Korea is slowing down. And for some reasons, which you certainly know, 6 of them. First, South Korea is a more mature economy. And we know that in a more mature economy, the growth of rate is not what it was at the very beginning, when also you made the transition from agriculture to industry. So the normal growth rate in South Korea today, I would say, is closer to 4% than to 7% if everything goes well, because you are more mature and the world is slowing down. Second reason, which impacts South Korea, and you have, and this is true all over the world, but it's true here, you have an aging population. Okay, so the number of active and dynamic workers is going down. And demography is a very significant factor in any economic trend, which tends to be underestimated. Just as an apart, when we talk about Japan, let's not forget that the main reason for Japan slowing down has nothing to do with economic policies. It has to do with an aging population and the refusal to have an immigration policy. Third reason why you have a slowing down in South Korea, just 1 second, I'm sorry. You have in South Korea, and this can be repaired, but not easily, what I call private and public over-regulation. Why private and public? Public over-regulation is well known. I will just mention the labor market, which is heavily over-regulated in South Korea, and which is not a positive factor because we know that the creative economy requires more destructive creation. And the labor market in South Korea is an obstacle on the road of destructive creation. You are business people and economists, so I don't need to elaborate on the concept of destructive creation. You have a lot of environment protection, because it's been extremely fashionable since 10 years in South Korea. But environment protection, I don't say it's good or bad, but I do say that it does slow down also the process of destructive creation. So you have an aging population, regulated labor market, regulated environment protection, and you have what I call private overregulation. What do I mean by that? The chaebol, by their very size, are like regulator on the market. They don't like competition. They don't like new entrepreneurs emerging on their market, which is perfectly normal. But there is because they are what they are, with all the benefits they bring to the South Korean economy, they also, by their mere existence, preventing the emergence of some new entrepreneurs. And I know that the South Korean president is fascinated by Steve Jobs and this kind of people who started a new company in their garage. And, well, you have no garage in South Korea. I mean, you have, but you don't have the financial circumstances. You don't have the venture capital. You don't have the market opening, which people like Steve Jobs or Hewlett and Packard did find on the American market, because you have this combination of private and public overregulation, and I would say maybe some difficulty to enter into the competition, just because they are so big. Okay. The fourth reason why South Korea seems a little bit shaky right now is that South Korean economy is very much dependent on the Chinese market. The Chinese market is slowing down, and for many reasons. I won't get into details, but there is no hope that the Chinese market in the years to come will be as dynamic as it has been since 10 years. So kind of an over-dependence on the Chinese market as a consequence will slow down the South Korean economy, which requires kind of a diversification of the of your export. The fifth reason, there are six. Fifth reason where South Korea seems a bit weak. If I compare South Korea with America, with France, Germany, and Japan, and the South Korea is not really producing services or manufacturing any products which are unique in the world. I just to explain myself. If you want to buy a real good champagne, you buy it in France, okay? No competitor. And if you want to buy some kind of machine tool, they are made only in Germany. Japan, even of its stagnation, you still have several thousand companies in Japan, very often medium size, who are the only one in the world to produce some kind of components. You may remember that after the what happened in China, in Japan, sorry, 2 years ago, and after the tsunami, and suddenly several hundred companies in Japan were not able to produce very tiny components. And you had factories all over the world which had to stop working. They couldn't work. They couldn't produce anymore because they were depending on these very specific Japanese components. And in the case of South Korea, you take shipbuilding, cars, electronics. I mean, they are very good, of course. Nobody denied that. But they can be made anywhere. So South Korea is missing, in a way, kind of a niche products on niche markets where South Korea would be unique. And there we'll come back to that when we talk about creativity and innovation. There is in the production diversity of South Korea, there is one link which is missing, which is kind of an expertise or missing link product or service which would be uniquely South Korean. This today is not yet the case. My sixth observation of why South Korea is slowing down, and I mention it, but I don't believe in it. Everybody says, well, our university system is obsolete, is conservative, and it's too Confucianist, and students don't know how to discuss, and the kind of a relationship with professor is not an encouragement toward creativity. Well, I'm not that sure. First of all the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, they are all drop out. So if the American university system was so good, I mean, they would have stayed in the university and created their companies afterwards. But Steve Jobs is typically a dropout. And same with Bill Gates. Bill Gates has a doctorate from Harvard University, but he got it when he was 50 years old. It was an honoris causa doctorate. So I think the American university system is not that good, and the Korean university system is not that bad. I mean, and also, based on my very modest personal experience, I go and give lectures to South Korean students since more than 20 years, and I've seen the evolution. The South Korean universities are being transformed very rapidly. They are more and more globalized, and the South Korean students are much better than the Japanese, for example, in English. And you have the possibility now to have very open and lively discussion with the students, which you could not have 20 years ago. So I think the criticism of the education system is a bit of an exaggeration, and also be very careful not to destroy what you have in order to replace it by some kind of ideal system, which would be the American universities. You just cannot do that. You can improve what you have, but certainly be careful in not destroying it. And also one of the reasons why South Korean companies are doing so well is because students and coming out of these universities, they have a very strong work ethics. And to have a very strong work ethics is as important as to be creative. I think to be creative without a work ethics is useless. So I mentioned this, but I have a more balanced view of the higher education system than what you usually hear and read about in this country. Now, coming to this definition of a creative economy, I will make 7 proposals. The first one, and this is something which I mentioned very often, and Dr. Il-Sakong knows by heart this, I introduced many years ago in the debate, in the mix here, the notion of added cultural value in South Korea. Okay? More people know today where South Korea stands, much more than 20 years ago, of course. But still, the notion that a product is good or better because it's proudly made in South Korea still doesn't appear. When you buy an American product or even a German product, it's written proudly made in the United States. When you buy a when you buy a Hyundai car or a Samsung phone, it is not written proudly made in South Korea. Because this notion of added value to the service and industrial products that you manufacture is not yet taken into consideration. It's not taken into consideration by the consumers, by the producers, by the government, and by the chaebol. Therefore, in order to introduce on the global market this very specific notion of added Korean value, this requires a joint effort by all the partners involved. It cannot be the government alone, it cannot be the company alone, it must be a joint effort of all these actors, and I very much, since many years, I've promoted the idea of a Korean foundation. You already have one, it's very small, but a Korean foundation to promote Korean culture, where private and public partner would cooperate. And this added value is also added benefit. It does make a difference in your balance sheet. I mean, the Germans, as you know, they can sell their cars, luxury cars or machine tools at any price because it's proudly made in Germany. French perfumes, of course, are sold at the unacceptable price for the consumer, but it's proudly made in France and it cannot be made anywhere else. And this does apply to the Japanese components because they are proudly made in Japan and therefore they are considered as reliable. So South Korea has not yet reached this stage of reliability and added cultural value. Second observation, let's take culture as if it were an economic product. And culture is not usually considered as an economic product, but it could, because people consume more and more cultural products. So cultural product is what? Is cinema, books, art, tourism, and any kind of cultural production, museum, And all this represents an asset which does exist in South Korea and which is not exploited. And, well, of course, you have an exception with Gangnam Style, but I think we can do better than that, and with better music. And I always quote a very simple example, which is the National Museum in Korea. Okay? National Museum in Korea is totally unknown abroad, never seen any promotion of this museum, nor in Europe, neither in the United States. I just give this very simple example to say that you have cultural asset, which is basically the Korean civilization, and which has never been considered and exploited as an economic asset, an economic product. You look at France, and tourism is one of our major exports. I think it's number one, actually, among our exports. You look at the United States. I mean, the cultural production, music, movie, and all that is one of the major exports by the United States. Okay, and I don't see why South Korea is such incapable to consider Korean culture as something which needs to be exported. Maybe you think we are so stupid that we cannot understand it, and not to mention food, of course, which could be a tremendous export. So all this should be extremely meaningful. It's not superficial. The figures are really important. You need to train the people to do that. If you get into the cultural business, you need to train the people. You don't need only to say, well, let's export our culture. No, I mean, you need to work about it. What the bottom of the marketing. By the way, the marketing of South Korea as a brand outside of South Korea, I don't want to offend anyone here, but it is a disaster. It is a disaster. Okay? It has never been coherent. It's impossible to understand. You never started from the foreign market. You never use any PR companies abroad. So it is a total disaster. Third proposal for more creative economy, and it has to do with promoting the Korean culture. And I will give again a very specific example. Japan, after World War II, has decided to rebuild its image, which was extremely negative. And they did it through the Japan Foundation and by creating a network of Japan institutes all around the world. And they were able, through this institute, to promote the Japanese civilization, to bring many foreigners to learn Japanese, and they rebuilt Japan as a positive image. France is doing that since many, many years with the French institutes. Germany is doing this with the Goethe Institute. The British are doing this with the British Council. And China, as you know, has decided to go for it by the creation of the so-called Confucius Institute all over the world, which are either independent or part of foreign universities. So the Chinese have understood very well how important is it to build a network in order to export what is left of Chinese culture. In the case of South Korea, to be honest, you do have Sejong Institutes. In many countries, I've even been said yesterday that there was a Sejong Institute in France. I don't know where it is. I don't know where. David, you know where it is? We have a French guy here. You know, okay, because you looked for it. So I think the money must be invested in the creation of Sejong Institute in key countries all around the world. And I will add the fourth idea, which I think could be very interesting. I think you are all more or less familiar with the Rhodes Scholar Fellowship, and which allows a certain number of American students every year to go and study for 1 year at Oxford University. Okay, an American entrepreneur, his name is Steven Schwarzman, has just created the equivalent for China at Tsinghua University. 200 students from around the world at an MBA level will be selected by a global jury and will be able to spend 1 year at Tsinghua University to learn about the Chinese language and to get familiar with the Chinese way, and then they come back to their country. I would love South Korea to take such an initiative, because we know that one of the relative weakness of South Korea is the unperfect globalization of the education system, okay? To tell it mildly. If someone in Korea, in the private sector, for example, would decide to create a sejong or, I don't know, scholarship, and to bring to South Korea every year 100 or 200 students to spend 1 year in a good university here in South Korea, the consequence could be tremendous. The return on investment would be very important, like the Rhodes Scholar, because you send back people to their own country. Usually they become a leader because they have a very good education. They are friends of South Korea. They know the language. They have spent years in South Korea. They have built a network, and you tremendously increase the good reputation, the image, and the connection with the next generation of leaders around the world. It doesn't cost such an amount of money to bring these scholars to South Korea, but I think that the initiative, which has just been taken in the United States by one man, and it will cost him $100 million a year, okay, which is not such big money for leading entrepreneurs, leading companies in South Korea. 100 million a year, okay, to bring scholars to South Korea for 1 year. And this was my proposal number 4. Proposal number 5, and I say that very often, I mean, and it's part of creativity. You need an immigration policy before you'll be invaded by migrants whom you have not chosen, which is already the case. Okay? Because the population is diminishing in South Korea. So you have an influx of workers, which basically comes from China. You don't choose them, actually. They come. And they find job, and legal or illegal. You cannot go on like that. You need a selective immigration policy for 2 reasons. First, you must bring in the country people you really need. And second, you must bring into the country people of high quality and with the kind of education or skill that the South Korean economy need. And if you don't do that, you'll have several millions of immigrants that you will not have chosen. Very often mentioned that there is one country in Europe which is doing that quite well, which is Switzerland. Switzerland, every year, the business community in Switzerland decide how many foreign workers do they need, what kind of workers. And so the Swiss government, based on the business community evaluation, says, well, okay, we need this year 50,000 workers in such and such discipline with such and such skill. And they get a working permit for 5 years, and they are allowed to stay in the country as long their working permit remain legal. And after 5 years, they're invited to go back to their country. It's not perfect, but it is the best system which I ever found. And I do think that the South Korea should definitely go this way, and you better do it now. If you don't do it now, in 5 years from now, you will have protests all over the country because you will have the wrong kind of immigration, and the South Korean will not be happy about that, and you will have resentment and hostility toward the migrants because they will not have been chosen by the South Korean themselves. 6, I'm nearly coming to the end of it, about creativity. What can the government do? And not much. What the government can do, immigration policy, that's a government policy, okay? And deregulation, that's also government policy. Can the government support innovation and research? Well, most of the innovation and research is done in the private companies, And I think that the private research center are more efficient than the public research center because the incentive is there. Yes. And also what the government can do in terms of research is to finance research in fields which are ignored by the private sector. Things that, well, innovation is what you don't know about. Basically, we don't know what will be the economy in 10 years from now. So what is interesting is to try to bring research and financial support to completely new field which have never been explored before. There is one field which comes to my mind, and I said before that the South Korean population and all the population around the world is becoming older and older. No country knows how to deal with an aging population. What kind of medical support, what kind of housing, what kind of transportation. So there is a huge market out there, which is the market of people, let's say, beyond 80. How will they live? No private company, no government has really thought about it. We have a huge new phenomenon. And I think this is really a field for research. We should be supported by government. And I think it's a very promising economic sector to provide the necessary support, transportation, medical, the way of life, and so on, for an aging population. And if I were to recommend one field where the government should invest its money, it's not evident. I mean, everybody would think about electronics and things like that. I say no. Look at the millions of people will become dependent in the coming years, and we don't have one instrument, neither technical nor human, to support these people to have a decent life until the end of their life. And the final remark, which will not make me popular, and South Korea needs to rebuild its tie with Japan. It's absolutely necessary for the geopolitical stability of the region and for economic reasons. I mean, the two economies have common interests. I mean, you must avoid a kind of war between currencies, between Japan and South Korea, which is starting these days. And I do think that the stabilization of the relationship between both countries would make both countries stronger. Japan has a lot to learn from South Korea. The education system today is better, I've seen both, in South Korea than it is in Japan. Okay? The Japanese, they have niche market, which the South Korean doesn't have. So I think there is kind of a complement interest between both countries. There is a complement interest for currency stabilization. There is a current interest also to keep this region stable and to prevent any attempt from China, North Korea, or any other country to bring destabilization. Because, of course, at the end of the day, the prosperity of South Korea depends on the stability of the region. And the stability of the region cannot depend only on the protection of the United States. I do think it very extensively depends on a cooperation between Japan and South Korea, which are the two countries in this part of the world which could be predictable vis-à-vis China, which is basically unpredictable. So maybe this has nothing to do with creative economy, but it's useless to talk about creative economy and added cultural value if the world around you is crumbling. So you better look at the world around you, stabilize this world, and then you can get into the more kind of detailed policies which I've this morning suggested. So I don't know what is a creative economy, but I think in 5 years from now we'll know. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Why don't you sit here?
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much. As usual, You shared very, very enlightening and insightful views on the Korean economy and the future of the Korean economy. Sorman has been always very, very candid, and he shares his views standing on our side, and I hope National Assemblymen from the government party is there, but I hope your legislators and the government policymakers listen to more carefully to what Sorman says. Actually, Guy has been telling me all the time the importance of culture from his perspective. In fact, one of the advices I followed, and which was very successful, was the choosing the venue for the G20 summit dinner at the National Museum. Actually, I was persuaded by Sorman, and that was my own idea, and that worked out very, very well. And the first ladies' dinner was held at the Lium, which is again National Museum. Again, that was my idea. I visited all these places, and also I brought these first ladies for lunch at the Kagu Bangmulgan, which is a very fantastic the museum, but in any case, we have many advices and suggestions to listen to the Sorman. Well, with this, if you have any comments or questions, we have about 20 to 25 minutes. Okay, Dr. Kim, please.
Thank you, Professor Sorman, for your enlightened and very creative aspects and comments under this issue. Now, you have touched many aspects of the creative economy, and it's very helpful to understand the whole thing about the creative economy. Now, the new government is really trying to relate the creative economy to the making of many jobs, many good jobs in the economy. So I would like to hear, perhaps what you had in mind in linking the creative economy to the creation of good jobs and many jobs. Thank you.
Well, as I said before, nobody can be against the creative economy and nobody can be against good jobs. And but the kind of industries and services which I'm trying to promote are rather sophisticated. For example, when I say that much more should be done in services and tourism, very often those are considered as low-paying jobs, which is not the case. At the bottom, certainly, but this kind of service industry, which is really underdeveloped in South Korea, requires special training and expertise. And so I wouldn't let you think that because I promote this kind of activity, those are low-skilled jobs. It is not the case. To manage an hotel, to manage a resort, to organize tourism, to build the business conference business in South Korea requires training, expertise, and skill. Okay, and also in economy you cannot decide that I'm going to produce only good jobs. No, what the government can do is create, a background where entrepreneurs will have the incentive, financial incentive and regulatory incentive to bring new activities, and the jobs will come as a consequence. It's purely politics to say I will create only good jobs. I mean, that has no economic meaning. You bring dynamism and the jobs appear as a consequence of this new dynamism.
Yeah, okay, Dr. An, please.
As usual, thank you very much for your very insightful proposals. Well, you mentioned that Japan has really created a very unique the SME systems which produced a very unique part and components. And for that matter, I think this Germany has also, what we call the hidden champions. My question is that why Korea has not been able to generate such a small and medium enterprises unique to produce a parts and component which no other countries can compete. Well, in this regard, I think we should learn a lot from Japanese tradition, their cultural legacies. And you also mentioned that the Korea and Japan need to complement each other to create this what we call, creative economy. But big problem we are facing at this point is that the Japanese political leadership tried to erase their the historical legacies, and they tried to erase their misdeed during the World War II, and so a lot of Koreans feel that the lack of the mutual trust, and perhaps that could be true on the Japanese side. They may feel also lack of trust on the Korean people. So given this psychological, gap between two economies, Japan and Korea, how we can create a complementary relationship, as you indicated, to promote a creative economy? Thank you.
Okay. In the case of if Japan, in Japan, I mean, each country has a long history, and if you want to understand why the component industry is so efficient and lead the world in Japan, there are two reasons. First is after World War II, the conglomerate, the Zaibatsu, has been dismantled. So many of the activities which were done in the Zaibatsu were scattered around, and it acted as an incentive for small entrepreneurs to start again out of the Zaibatsu, very often like as subcontractor, actually for the corporate, but to build their own company. And so this has been the consequence of the policy which happened after World War II. And there's another reason, as you know, this component industry, if you look at the map, I mean, it's a consequence of a very long history of art and craft. Okay, the Japanese have a very long history of art and craft, and they were very good, for example, at steel production since the 17th century. They were even better than the European. So it has been the convergence of two historical factors which have created these component industries. So you cannot really repeat that in South Korea, because in South Korea the strategy has been different. In South Korea, you had a large population with a agricultural background, and what their strength was a very strong work ethics, and the choice which had been made was to use the work ethics of the Korean worker, and this is why South Korean built this very large company, shipbuilding, cars, all this was based on the work ethics of the worker. And this is the history of South Korea. Now, is it possible to find a kind of a middle way? I think yes. It should be possible to split off from the chaebol some new activities. Maybe I'm certain it would be a mistake to destroy the chaebol, of course, but maybe some kind of fiscal encouragement and regulation in favor of more transparency and more competition through a transparency commission, something which you have in the United States, would help create kind of new activities which would not necessarily be within the chaebol but outside of the chaebol. But also you need to create a financial system, something like the venture capital system, which would enable these people to create their own company. Okay? So it's a kind of a subtle way. I don't agree with the discourse to go at the chaebol and they are responsible for everything. No, they are responsible for South Korean growth, basically. But transparency, competition, venture capital, so that you could create on the side and eventually become a subcontractor of the chaebol. And then you will have a path for innovation, which today is very narrow, because you are in the chaebol or out of the chaebol. But in between, there is like a third sector which is missing in South Korea. And regarding Japan, I always mention to Korean friend and Japanese friend our experiment with Germany, and the relationship between Germany and France, to say the least, has not been better than the relation between Japan and South Korea. Okay, and you can compare. Still, we have been able to build a reconciliation. Why? Because it has not been done by diplomats and governments. It has been done by business people. And basically, the man whom we call the father of Europe, Jean Monnet, he was a merchant of cognac. And Jean Monnet, they said, well, we try to reconcile, we try to unify Europe. We made a big mistake. We rely on diplomats and politicians. And of course, these people cannot agree by definition. And so let's do it at a business level. And this is what Jean Monnet did. And the reconciliation was the result of free trade, business agreement, and the political dimension, the treaties, came in a second stage. So I strongly advocate, in the case of these two countries, forum between business people, forum between scholars, working on common books of history, in learning. In France and Germany, children are learning from the same book the history of the German in France. It totally changed the mindset of the young people. And the young people, for them, the past is the past. I mean, they learn a different history. So I think the reconciliation is possible, but it should use much more creative roads than the kind of, purely diplomatic and political road which is today taken, and which will lead nowhere. And even if I may, just for 1 second, I mean, because I told the anecdote to President Lee Myung-bak, and I was talking about this once when he was visiting Paris, and I gave him the example of the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. How did it happen? The Sadat, who was the president of Egypt at that time, decided on his own to go directly to the parliament in Israel. And he asked no permission. He went to the parliament. You couldn't stop him. He talked to the Israeli parliament and he said, "We Arabs, we hate you. We hate you for good reasons. You have been awful with you." And, he explained all the reason why the Arabs didn't like Israel. And at the end of this very strong discourse, he said, "Okay, I've said what the Arab people think of you. It has never been said to you before. I wanted to say to you directly. Now let's shake hands and sign peace." And it worked. So Lee Myung-bak asked one of his assistants, "Could I have this speech translated into Korean?" I mean, it's through this kind of completely, innovative, grand gesture or small gesture than the hatred between Korea and Japan can go away. Another anecdote, if I may. 3 weeks ago in Paris, I had the visit of a delegation. This is off the record, okay? But I had the visit in Paris of a delegation sent by the South Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And they wanted me to take position on the .co island situation, because I had written about it, and I said that there is a solution out of it. And my proposal is that you should forget about sovereignty in the first stage. You should say, like diplomats often say, we agree to disagree. Okay? So you agree to disagree. But Japan and South Korea should have a common scientific project. Use the island as a basis, as a laboratory, build a scientific project to explore the maritime resources of the region and so on. Okay? Work together. The sovereignty debate will come second. So the South Korean delegation listened to me. They were all diplomats, and they said, this is a very good project. We agree. But of course, first, the Japanese have to recognize that the island belongs to South Korea. So I said, okay, they understood nothing. And they, but you need to be creative. And by being creative and not relying on the professional, you can get somewhere.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Yeah. You know, about 3 days ago, I was asked to give a keynote address at the Korea-Japan business leaders gathering. About 300 business people were there, many from Japan, and Fukuda was keynote speaker for the Japanese side, former Prime Minister Naive. So I said, you know, this region, in Northeast Asia, the economy has been integrating very, very fast, primarily by market forces, no institutional cooperative the arrangements up until very recently, only in ASEAN plus 3 and but no FTA so far or anything, but still it's very, very highly integrated. But with government level, the institutional level cooperation, this area can be much more interdependent. Integrated and will be very, very beneficial. But I said, how can you have government level cooperation without mutual trust and the spirit of cooperation? And to build a mutual trust, you have to get free from the past negative historical legacy. And without that, you just start from you going nowhere. And so for that purpose, politicians in both countries, this country as well, should not try to take advantage of this kind of negative feeling people have toward each other. But politicians tend to take advantage of this kind of negative feelings. And so we always don't look forward, always look backward. So we have to solve this. Now we have to learn from Germany and France, and but somehow we just don't have that reconciliation. And under this kind of circumstances, just government level cooperation can't be done. So as you are right to say that the private sector do more, but there's a limit to it. So, Billy Brandt went to a Jewish cemetery. Yes. And he knelt down and repeatedly German the leaders do that. But what's happening in Japan today? Say, you try to justify even the invasion and the war. So how can Korean people or Chinese people will accept that?
I don't say it's easy. I say, I say it must be done.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I fully agree. And also we should get along very well with Japanese for many reasons. I've been saying all along, and we have to have very good relations. And we have to, both sides have to work. We shouldn't just blame Japanese. We should blame ourselves as well. But we have to work together. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Any? Yes, Dr. Arndt.
If nobody raises any questions, I really would like to, maximize your presence here. Well, this is one of my agonizing sort of the moment after seeing the North Korean, provocation, especially on the part of the Kim Jong-un. In recent weeks, many international, people believe that Korea now pays out two sort of the Korean waves. One from Kim Jong-un taking all the newspaper headlines all over the world, and the other one is, Psy, having the gentleman's sort of K-pop music. And in many cases, you indicated that the importance of the national brand image, you suggest that to create a Sejong Institute type, all over the world and inviting Rhodes Scholars or something like that. My question is that, many people around the world are confused with, two Koreas, and in fact, many of them cannot distinguish North Korea and South Korea. So our problem is that how we can, resolve these issues. And Kim Jong-un sent totally, opposite mixed signals to the world, and South Korea tried to our own image as sort of soft power. We are under, big dilemma. So what is your suggestion to distinguishing ourselves from North Korean behavior?
Yes, I know the problem, of course, which doesn't make soft power very easy. My position, and this, of course, is a bit controversial, but my position is that the South Korean government represents the Korean people, including North Korean people. And that the North Korean regime is something which is totally different. And so I would say you have the Korean people and the Korean civilization. And the Korean people and the Korean civilization is represented here because this is a democracy, and this is the expression of the Korean soul and the Korean success. When people buy a Samsung cell phone, they know it's not made in North Korea. And to say, well, we have a regime which represents only itself, because it has no legitimacy at all. And I think this is a way which could be easily understood, and which will make this software of this kind of a soft foreign policy possible. Make clearly the distinction between the North Korean regime and the Korean people. You represent the Korean people, okay? And the North Korean regime, it's only a puppet regime, probably supported by China, but of course not supported by the Korean people.
Very well said. Okay. Yeah, there's Koreans, the same Koreans, but under different regime, and the bad regime, and that is the problem.
Yeah, it's a problem,
right?
but it's just, but they represent themselves, basically.
Yeah.
They represent themselves, and people know that.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Yes, the last question, yes.
First, thanks for your good lecture. And my question is that, regarding to marketing Korea as a brand, you mentioned that Korean government is doing a really poor job, almost to the point of disaster. So why do you think is the basic reason that Korea lags so far behind other countries when it comes to promoting Korea to the world?
Well, I say it's a disaster. Well, I would say it's disappointing. It's disappointing. The reason is, once again, I think you were there when we had this discussion with the President Lee Myung-bak. there is really nobody in charge at the government level of this problem. Nobody's in charge. I think the export had become, huge priority. Let's export more. So quantity came first, and so this notion of branding was a little bit, second or completely ignored. Nobody was really discussing that, and so it was not translated into an actual policy. And after many discussions with the former President Lee Myung-bak, the president created a branding committee. But sorry, it didn't put expert in this committee. They were nice people, but they were not professional. So I think it has never been considered as a political priority. You have no minister in charge of that. You have no administration in charge of that. And it's not done in a professional manner. If you take Japan again. What they do, they use marketing agencies in the different countries, because what the French or the German or the American expect from Japan is not the same everywhere. Okay? Here in South Korea, there have been some promotion campaigns which are exactly the same in the US, in France, in Germany. But the expectancy is not the same. So it's very strange for me that the South Korean companies are so good at marketing, and the government is so bad. So maybe this should be privatized. I think that the government should. This is why I very much think that it should be a foundation. It should be a joint venture between the public and the private sector. Because large South Korean companies, they have such an expertise in marketing, in promoting their products. Nobody's better than Hyundai or Samsung or LG abroad. So bring this expertise and build a brand. But first of all, the priority that the government must understand that this is important, this is a priority, and there are a lot of benefits, financial and economic benefit for the country. This has not yet been understood. This is why it doesn't work.
Mr. Yu is there. He's from Financial Service Commission. Yeah. I think we have to do. Okay, Dr. Kim. Dr. Chen, I'm sorry. Chamber, yes.
Professor Sorman, you just said one great creative idea. You just said we should privatize the government, or at least part of the government. I think that's one way to create a creative economy.
Yes.
I have a comment on your suggested ideas. Great ideas, but most of your ideas are, I think it's a long-term to create a culture-based service economy, which I agree. Because that's the way Korea should move, to create more service industry and be more competitive in service industry, in order to jump up to much more advanced economy or economic status. However, as you said in the beginning, economics is long-term, politics short-term, and those ideas would take long-term, would take long years, several years at least. And since politics is short-term, and the Korean government has only one 5-year term presidency, and government is, as said earlier, is looking for ideas, creative ideas to create creative economy, in order to create jobs. Any short-term ideas, especially where Korea at the moment has competitiveness, which is basically manufacturing or IT industry, and I think that's where government is looking, but at the same time, you're suggesting more of a long-term solution.
Look, as you mentioned, as I mentioned myself, the economy is long-term, okay? And you have to be honest. And I do understand that the political government needs short-term fix. And but among the some of the proposals I made, some could be implemented very rapidly. To build a brand, for example, takes 1 year. And if you were to convince Samsung to write on this Galaxy model, which is a worldwide success, proudly made in South Korea. This takes 2 weeks. It takes longer to convince Samsung, but to do it, it's quite short term if they find an interest. Okay, build a brand, promote products as being made in South Korea. This is quite short term. Build scholarships so that all over the world, in major universities, in Europe, in the United States, suddenly the best students would know that for 1 year, they can spend 1 year free in this mysterious country, which is South Korea. This has immediate consequence. So you have some of what I suggest can have immediate results. Now to build a new sector of middle-sized high-tech enterprises, we shouldn't lie to ourselves. This will not be done overnight. But bring transparency in the economy, and competition. Create a company, create a finance company specialized in venture capital. This can be done overnight. And so there are some of the proposal I make. If there is a political will, this can go extremely rapidly. Extremely rapidly. Yes, I think so. Some of them, yes. They would really bring something new in the mix, show that something has changed.
Yeah. Okay, we have to end here. We have let the Sorman go. I'm sure we'll bring him back more soon. And we really appreciate you sharing your very, very insightful views and ideas. And you just keep writing, and I hope in Korean newspapers as well. And his books will be translated and widely read. Hopefully by the policymakers and the legislatures, so that his really the ideas and his love for Korea will be realized. Okay, with this, please join me in thanking Sorman for very excellent.